June of 1942. 6 months after the triumph of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese juggernaut was supposed to own the Pacific. Unstoppable, unchallenged, Admiral Chuchi Nagumo stood high on the bridge of his flagship, the Akagi, surveying the greatest carrier strike force ever assembled. His 4 carriers, the Kido Bitai, were the razor edge of the empire. But on June 4th, the unthinkable occurred. Out of the immense, empty blue came the Angels of Iron Wrath, American dauntless dive bombers, screaming down at impossible angles. It was not a prolonged engagement. It was an execution. In 6 frantic, terrifying minutes, the fate of the Japanese Empire was sealed. Explosions ripped through the fueled and fully armed hangars below deck. The Kaga, the Soryu, and Nagumo's own Akagi, 3 proud carriers suddenly transformed into burning funeral pyres, black smoke roiling miles into the sky. The devastating news reached Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto hundreds of miles away. As the report solidified, for carriers lost in a single morning, Yamamoto's face went utterly, chillingly white. The words he spoke next stunned every officer in the room, acknowledging a catastrophe nobody believed possible. The Americans had pulled off a miracle. Midway was not merely a defeat. It was a stunning, crippling pivot point that tore the heart out of the Imperial Navy. But here's the critical truth Tokyo desperately tried to hide for decades, the dark secret buried within the initial damage reports. The complete, unprecedented annihilation of their naval air power. The entire trajectory of the Pacific War had shifted in less than an hour. The sky above Mortain was no longer blue. It was a suffocating shroud, thick with the oily residue of shattered steel and burning fuel. The columns of noxious smoke clawed thousands of feet into the ravaged atmosphere, a funeral pyre visible for 50 miles. Lieutenant Carl Hartman watched, immobilized, the acrid, heavy air filling the tank's hatch. He felt unable to breathe. Tony Vitelli, the driver, waited below for the order to move, rigid in the seat. Earl Bishop, the gunner, had already logged the coordinates of destruction in the silent chamber of his mind. The silence from Lieutenant Hartman was deafening. He stared fixedly at the blackened wreck of a heavy tank, a stark, twisted monument to the failure of Operation Luttich. His officers and the remaining tank crews waited for the necessary tactical command, the first cold details for the inevitable AR. But Lieutenant Hartman offered nothing. He was a statue carved from exhaustion and disbelief. Later, a field intelligence officer would describe the look on his face as that of a man witnessing the collapse of an entire strategy. The grim, immediate realization that the desperate German drive for revanche had cost them their last reserve of military might. By sunset, the core of the attack force was gone. The most powerful armored thrust hurled by the Germans in weeks had been pulverized in a single, brutal engagement. But the field devastation was only the beginning. The real story begins further back, deep within the headquarters tent, where the high command processed the failure. Because the official reaction to the catastrophe and the fate of men like Lieutenant Hartman and Major George Marks would reveal the darkest secret about the entire campaign. The devastating message reached the command post. Major George Marks, the tactical genius who had promised victory only hours earlier, was just 300 yards away when the radio operator handed him the slip. It was 12:30 p.m. The terse report confirmed the immediate carnage. Asterisk, the spearhead is destroyed. Casualties extreme. Asterisk, Marks read the chilling words. Then, his face betraying his terror, he demanded the message be confirmed. Surely it was a mistake. Surely James Ortega, the loader from Lieutenant Hartman's crew temporarily assigned to the Signal Corps, had garbled the transmission. 20 minutes. That was all the time the clock allowed before the next volley of signals ripped through the flagship. Kaga, sinking. Then a frantic confirmation, Soryu abandoned. Finally, the unthinkable, Hiryu under relentless attack. The veneer of command shattered. Eyewitness accounts claim Admiral Yamamoto's composure dissolved. His hands began to tremor uncontrollably. Without a word, the architect of Pearl Harbor turned his back on the command center and retreated into his private cabin. For 3 agonizing hours, the war stopped for him. He locked the door. No one dared approach. Through the steel plating, officers could only catch muffled, broken phrases. The admiral arguing with ghosts. When he finally emerged, the transformation was absolute. His face was a mass of granite, stripped of all emotion, all spirit. One aide, chilled to the bone, later scribbled into his diary, "The admiral looked like a dead man walking." But the war still demanded a voice. At 4 p.m., Yamamoto returned to the bridge. The air was thick and heavy, the silence absolute. Every officer snapped to attention, their eyes fixed on the man who held the fate of the Imperial Navy in his hands. They waited for direction, for strategy, for the rallying cry of their commander-in-chief. Yamamoto ignored them all. He stared down at the large navigation chart spread across the table, the blue ink mocking the devastation of the Pacific. Then, in a voice terrifyingly soft, he spoke the first words he had uttered since the terrible news arrived. Words that would echo for decades to the halls of military history. Japan has lost the war. The revelation hit the command center like a physical blow. A collective gasp was swallowed by the stunned silence. One captain started to. A chorus of panicked denial erupted from the remaining admirals. "Admiral, we still have battleships. We still have the superiority of our surface fleet." But Yamamoto didn't yield to the frenzy. His voice was a flat, cold edge cutting through the Admiralty's desperate chatter. "Asterisk, we have lost a strategic initiative, and we will never get it back." Asterisk, this was not despair. This was surgical military analysis. Yamamoto was stating a cold fact of industrial arithmetic that his colleagues were willfully blind to. He knew something they could not yet grasp. The fate of the entire Japanese empire had been strapped to those four sinking hulls. With Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu gone, the audacious plan for conquest was not just crippled. It had collapsed into ruin. But the true horror lies in the prophecy. Months before the inferno at Midway, Yamamoto had already drawn the blueprint of this precise catastrophe. He had warned Tokyo. He had pleaded, and they had dismissed him. What unspeakable warning did the emperor's inner circle refuse to hear? The warning they ignored. December 1941. The immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor. The nation was drunk on glory. Tokyo streets flowed with triumph. Newspapers declared it the greatest naval victory in history. The emperor himself praised the audacity of the attack. The belief was unanimous. America, the industrial giant, would surrender within months. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was not celebrating. Behind closed doors, in a private meeting with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was not simply a strategist. He was a prophet casting a chilling shadow over the ambitions of an entire empire. He delivered a disturbing, devastating assessment to the Prime Minister. "I can run wild for 6 months. After that," he guaranteed, "I guarantee nothing." 6 months. That was a hard limit of Japan's viable offensive window. Yamamoto understood the cruel arithmetic of total war. Japan's finite, fragile industrial base could never match the ceaseless, overwhelming output of the American industrial behemoth. The great fleet carriers were not merely ships. They were the irreplaceable spearhead of the empire. If they were lost, there would be no shipyards, no trained crews capable of replacing them. There would be no second chance. But in the intoxicating delirium of initial victory, this cold, strategic warning was dismissed as weakness. The Prime Minister ignored it. The army generals, trapped by their own rigid dogma, scorned him. They called Yamamoto too cautious, too Western in his thinking. One arrogant general even dared to accuse the architect of Pearl Harbor of being a defeatist. Now, with the catastrophic precision of a ticking clock, exactly 6 months had passed. Yamamoto's prophecy had ripped through the heart of the Imperial Navy. The carriers, the irreplaceable instruments of victory, were gone. Japan's offensive might was utterly destroyed. The war would now grind into precisely what Yamamoto feared most: a devastating, attritional struggle against an inexhaustible foe. A battle Japan could not possibly win. Yet, even as the empire bled out, Tokyo still refused to comprehend the crushing reality. The hemorrhage was irreversible, but the Imperial General Headquarters was dedicated to the delusion. The devastating news finally reached the capital, silencing the halls of power at precisely 8 p.m. The calendar flipped to Japanese time, but the date mattered little. It was the hour of judgment. Within the insulated halls of the Imperial Navy headquarters, the veneer of iron discipline cracked instantly. Admirals, guardians of the nation's destiny, erupted into a furious cacophony. Some demanded immediate, suicidal vengeance, a counterblow to salvage honor. Others screamed for recall, for the immediate retreat of what little remained. The high command was a storm of despair and conflicting loyalties. But above the chaos, one dread duty loomed, informing the emperor. This failure triggered the deepest cultural dread. In the rigid hierarchy of Imperial Japan, one did not offer the son of heaven catastrophe. One filtered it, softening the edges of disaster until the news resembled a minor tactical setback. The Navy minister was chosen to carry the burden. He moved through the hushed halls of the imperial palace, the weight of the nation on his shoulders. He did not speak of annihilation. He told the emperor that certain carriers had sustained significant damage during an ongoing tactical engagement. The battle, he reported, was still developing. He meticulously avoided the fatal word, lost. But the emperor, sequestered yet deeply aware, was not fooled by the careful linguistic scaffolding. He listened to the recitation of euphemisms, his face an impassive mask carved from stone. When the minister finished, the emperor simply asked a single, quiet question that cut through all the lies. How many operational flight decks remain under your command? The subsequent silence was absolute, a void where national ambition had once resided. Finally, the minister bowed low, unable to meet the divine gaze. His voice was a raw whisper. "None, your majesty." The emperor gave no sign of anger, no flicker of surprise. He absorbed the ultimate betrayal of fate and merely nodded. Then, with a slow gesture, he dismissed his advisers. He wanted to be alone. What occurred in that isolated room? The thoughts of the divine monarch facing total defeat, the acceptance of ruin, the plans for a future that no longer existed, no living man knows. The German High Command, paralyzed by failure, opted for a desperate, suicidal punch, a massive counterattack codenamed Operation Luttich. The objective was clear: shatter the Allied flank and reach the vital coastal town of Avranches. But standing directly in their path, entrenched in the shattered landscape near Mortain, was a handful of armored American tenacity, led by the Sherman of Lieutenant Carl Hartmann. Inside the steel oven, the air was a choking mix of high-octane fumes and adrenaline. The world outside had dissolved into the thunder of heavy armor, moving at speed. "Gunner, left 30 degrees. Tiger, hull down. Give me AP," screamed Lieutenant Hartmann into the comms, his voice scraping against the roar of the engines. In the cramped turret, Earl Bishop, the gunner, locked the sights onto the looming shape, his hand steady despite the shuddering impact of incoming fire. He squeezed the trigger. A violent crack. Then the world rushed back in. "Load. Load fast, Ortega." Bishop yelled, sweat blinding him. James Ortega, the loader, was a blur of frantic motion, the heavy shell casings tearing at his fingers as he rammed a fresh armor-piercing round into the breach. Clang. Up. Ready. Below, the vital lifeline of the tank. Tony Vitelli, the driver, maneuvered the Sherman with terrifying precision, inching forward over the debris of fallen comrades, determined to give Bishop the perfect angle. "We got infantry flanking, Lieutenant. They're coming hard." Every second of that brutal fight would be dissected later. Every decision, every wasted round, every moment of hesitation. They were fighting not just a German advance, but the terrifying prospect of the aftermath. Later, if they survived, Lieutenant Hartmann would spend weeks detailing every split-second choice in the mandatory AR. Failure to hold this ground, abandoning the fight before the last possible moment, guaranteed a swift and devastating court-martial. But those consequences, however dire, were distant shadows. The only reality was the fire, the steel, and the absolute imperative. Push back the counterattack, or the road to Avranches was wide open. The air over the capital was thick with the dust of denial. The defeat was a secret too terrifying for Tokyo to bear, threatening not just the Imperial Navy, but the very foundation of faith in the war effort. The decision was made. The truth would be buried, but the cover-up was no shield. It was a self-inflicted wound, A catastrophic deception that created a strategic cancer that would ultimately consume the empire. Tokyo Command, shackled by their own lie, became trapped in a fatal inertia. By hiding the magnitude of their loss, they neutralized their ability to adapt. Strategy could not be altered. Defenses could not be built. They could not tell their factories to prioritize carrier production or vital oilers because the official records maintained that all was well, that victory was assured. And so, the relentless bleeding continued. For months, the Imperial forces kept attacking, kept pushing forward, fighting a phantom war built entirely on the pretense of success. While their naval power dissolved, Japan insisted it was winning. American intelligence watched the spectacle unfold across the Pacific with stunned incomprehension. They saw fleets dangerously dispersed, vital logistical hubs left undefended, and costly resources thrown into strategically meaningless assaults. One American admiral summarized the bizarre reality. It's like they don't even know they're losing. He was right, because the vast majority of the high command and almost every man fighting the war had no idea the battle had already been lost. The truth was a poison, quarantined at the highest levels. Crippled by their own internal deception, Imperial commanders marched blindly. Field officers drew lines on maps using phantom strengths, utterly unaware that the foundation of the war had crumbled 6 months earlier at Midway. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto held the terrible, solitary burden of reality. And what followed was perhaps the conflict's most profound tragedy. He continued to fight a war he knew irrevocably was already lost. Yamamoto swallowed the defeat whole. He sealed his lips regarding Midway in public, pouring his legendary discipline into frenzied operational planning. Desperate to conjure a miracle that would invalidate his own terrifying assessment, he threw himself into the future, tried to salvage something from a disaster too massive to acknowledge. Yet, in the hushed confidence of his closest aide, he uttered the chilling, final prophecy. Japan is still marching toward the cliff, and no one will stop walking. 1 year later, over the suffocating jungle canopy of Bougainville, American P-38 Lightnings intercepted his flight. Yamamoto's aircraft plummeted into the trees. He died carrying the crushing knowledge that his prediction had been correct. Japan had lost the war the moment the first carrier went down at Midway. Everything that followed was merely a slow, agonizing collapse toward inevitable, total defeat. The fatal silence surrounding the debacle would last until final broadcast of 1945, when the atomic shadow finally lifted and the documents were unsealed 3 long years later. The world gasped. The staggering truth about Midway, the fatal hemorrhage of the Imperial Navy, had been buried alive while the Japanese people were fed a triumphant, deadly lie. In the hushed, gilded halls of Tokyo's high command, the air was thick with the scent of defeat. They knew in the cold, sickening instant the 4 carriers vanished beneath the Pacific waves, that the war was over. That realization was only ever spoken in a desperate, forbidden whisper. We have lost the war. Yet, to the nation, the emperor, and the thousands of fighting men still sailing the unforgiving Pacific, the message transmitted was immutable. We are winning. That calculated deception, that monstrous, systemic lie, did more damage than the American bombs ever could. It sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives upon the altar of an unattainable victory. Midway was not merely a battle lost. It was a catastrophic fulcrum upon which the fate of an empire turned. The Japanese admirals understood the immediate, crushing strategic consequence. But instead of confronting reality, Tokyo chose silence and denial. The Imperial Japanese Navy deliberately concealed the utter destruction of its carrier fleet from its own people, fabricating reports and erasing history in real time. This was a dark moment when Japan's military leadership chose pride over truth. This fundamental betrayal, the choice of deception over reality, irrevocably sealed their ultimate doom.